Good evening. You're watching ThinkTech's Asia in Review, and we have got a very unusual program for you this evening. We're going to be talking about the U.S. Marines in Japan and their role in the U.S.-Japan alliance. And of course, I'm sure some of you are immediately thinking, as soon as you hear the word U.S. Marines and you connect it with the word Japan, then the word Okinawa comes up. And we will get to Okinawa, I promise you that. Our guest this evening is an extraordinary individual. This is Dr. Robert Eldridge. And Dr. Eldridge, it's nice to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you
and,
for having me.
This is what's really special about Robert is this. He is a senior U.S. Government official, and his role in Japan is, let's tell everybody what it is.
Well, it's basically as the political advisor to the Marine Corps in Japan.
Okay, I'll translate that for you. He's very modest. Robert is the senior political guru for the United States Marines in Japan. And fair enough?
That's a very nice compliment, yes, thank you.
And so we've got, as you begin to understand in this program what a political advisor is all about, and we'll get into that in just a moment, you'll begin to see the kind of the critical relationship that our guest on this show plays in terms of the U.S.-Japan alliance and the relationship between the U.S. Marine Corps and Japan generally. And we'll get into that as we go along here. Now, some of you, I know, may be thinking, the big question comes up in your mind, if we look at the U.S.-Japan relationship over the years, we see something that looks like a beautiful omelet, and you're saying to yourself, well, maybe this omelet is now broken with problems that have occurred in the past, and also in the back of your mind, there may be this whole pivot that's been talked about of the U.S. military to Asia, or I've heard some talk about it as a refocus. I think that was the Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta talked about it as a refocus on Asia. And you've in that context, I think you've heard about the shifts and drawdowns of Marines on Okinawa. Maybe audience or listeners, you've heard about maybe something about the public media or public opinion or media treatment of the Marines on Okinawa. And certainly you've heard about the conduct of Operation Tomadachi and the whole Fukushima incident, that whole relief effort that the Marine Corps was heavily involved in over the last year. And we want to talk about future disaster preparedness in Japan and the impact and implications on all of this for U.S.-Japan relations and the U.S.-Japan alliance. Kind of, where are we? And so we're very fortunate to have Dr. Eldridge with us here this evening to help us straighten out this whole, I'm going to call it a mess temporarily, but I'm sure you'll be able to help straighten it out as we go along here.
I'm hoping to.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So let's get started, Robert, with kind of help our audience understand a little bit. You mentioned what your position is, but let's talk kind of a little bit about your background that gives you the ability to work with the local people in Japan.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for having me today. I've been in Japan for 22 years.
22 years.
22 years. I originally went over on a program called the JET program, and that's something sponsored by the Japanese government, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. I taught middle school for 2 years, really fell in love with the country, pursued language study, entered graduate school over there. In the middle of graduate school, we had the Kobe earthquake, and I was attending graduate school at Kobe University. And that really bonded the friends I had at the university, and also my role in that country. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then eventually I went into teaching and research full-time. A lot of the research I did was about the U.S.-Japan relationship. which I call a marriage as opposed to an omelet, and the U.S.-Japan alliance. During the course of that time, I had the opportunity to come back to Hawaii and work here at Camp Smith as a political advisor up there. And during that time, not only did I fall in love with Hawaii, but also with the Marine Corps. And then several years ago, I resigned my position at the university to begin working for the Marine Corps full-time.
Okay. What I want to talk about next is in the last several days, you were given an extraordinary award by former Prime Minister Nakasone. What's that all about?
That was an award that I was presented at the end of June. The award is in recognition of contributions in academia, education, security issues, environmental issues, all sorts of work to younger scholars, practitioners. In my case, I was nominated earlier this year without my knowledge, but I'm very happy to have been nominated, both for the research that I've done over the years on U.S.-Japan relations, and also the work that I was privileged to be a part of in Operation Tomadachi, working up in the Tohoku area immediately after the disaster. So some Japanese scholars who are familiar with my work nominated me, and Prime Minister Nakasone and his committee recognized that nomination.
Very cool.
Thank you.
Let's look a little bit into or dig into your involvement in Operation Tomadachi. And you mentioned before that you were at university in Kobe.
Mm-hmm.
1995, the earthquake happens, and so that's a cultural country bonding experience, in time of real hardship that you went through with the residents of Kobe. And so some years later, what did you do to take that experience and create some kind of wisdom or advice coming out of the Kobe earthquake that was ultimately used in handling the whole challenge in the Tohoku region and Fukushima that we are also familiar with now?
Right. Well, there were probably several things I was involved with. Immediately after the earthquake in Kobe, a lot of international organizations, including U.S. forces in Japan, tried to provide support to Japan. Some things and some efforts were received and accepted, others were not. And so for a long time I was very interested in the question of, if there were another large-scale disaster in Japan, is that country or any country really ready to accept international support? Subsequently, when I served here in Hawaii back in 2004, the viewers will remember that there was a major earthquake and tsunami off of Indonesia that affected...
Right, this is the Aceh.
Correct, back in December 2004. And a year after that, when I was back at the university, we organized a symposium that brought together different players from the region, and we spent a whole day kind of examining the lessons learned from that disaster. And during the course of the discussions, no one raised the question of, if this happened in Japan, would it be ready? And so I decided to work on a study that looked at the question of Japan's readiness based on the 1995 Kobe earthquake, as well as the example of another country, in this case many countries, being able to accept the support. Unfortunately, the the results of the study that I did suggested that Japan wasn't fully ready to accept the support in a timely manner. And so I made some recommendations about working with U.S. forces that were in Japan already, and maybe coming up with a disaster assistance agreement ahead of time, so that the respective players would know what to expect from one another and how to respond. And also, with an agreement in place, you could begin practicing, exercising those agreements, so that you really knew what to expect and what to prepare for. Unfortunately, those recommendations weren't implemented as quickly as I would have liked. For years, I'd been working with Japanese authorities about getting their awareness level up, and also communicating my ideas with U.S. military officials about being able to respond within Japan at a moment's notice and working closely with the Japanese forces. When, unfortunately, last year the March 11th disaster hit, some arrangements weren't in place, but we're working at getting those arrangements in place now. But fortunately, the response that the Marine Corps in particular provided was very, very quick, and that's because of the state of readiness that the Marines are always in.
So, I mean, let me kind of summarize what you've said and see if I understand what you're saying, that you had the good fortune, and I might say the United States had the good fortune of you doing this English language training in the JET program. You're out of college, and you're going to graduate school. Ultimately, you're going to graduate school in Kobe, Japan.
Correct.
And the 1995 earthquake hits, and you're there to experience it live and up close and personal, right?
Right.
And so you're able to observe the challenges that the Japanese self-defense forces as well as the government has in coordinating not only with the U.S. Marines but international assistance, right? I mean, you can see that. So over the next 10, 11 years, that interest builds and results in a study that you do and some recommendations to improve Japan's ability to handle international aid and cooperation in disaster situations, something like that, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So that study then results in some improvement, not perfect, not fully implemented, but essentially, if I understand what you're saying correctly, Robert, and I want to talk to the viewer, I want to talk to you for a moment. This gentleman has been the individual that has at least partially prepared the blueprint for the cooperation between the Marine Corps and the Japanese government in the event of an emergency, which was implemented in the Tohoku 311 Fukushima tsunami mess. I like using the word mess. It's a technical term.
Well, yeah, it was a major disaster. It was the big difference between the Kobe disaster and Tohoku was that the magnitude of the earthquake, the scale of the destruction, the tsunami, as well as the Fukushima nuclear reactor, just made a major disaster that much worse. So even an experience at Kobe really couldn't prepare me for what we faced up there.
What I'm sure our audience wants to know, what was it in your I'm assuming that this architectural blueprint for disaster preparedness in Japan was a major piece of the impetus for this Nakasone Award that you just received. Not exclusively, but
that's my understanding of one of the reasons I was nominated, yes.
okay. So that blueprint, our audience is sitting there saying, well, what is it that Dr. Eldridge recommended that was of enormous assistance in the response time or the coordination during the Operation Tomadachi?
Well, there are several pieces to those recommendations in the past, and there are several things that, in my opinion, still need to be done, and we're looking at those right now, and I'll mention that in a moment. But in the end, it's about getting people working together with other people. Organizations can only function so well without that human connection. They may be similar military organizations, but if they don't know each other, they don't know each other's capabilities, then they're going to have a more difficult time working together. If it's an aid organization, if they've never worked with another local community or an organization that is unfamiliar to them, plugging in and working together is going to be that much harder. So basically the gist of the recommendations is there will be another disaster. We don't know when, we don't know where. So let's start getting the mutual understanding, the people in place, practicing the different scenarios. Just like in a local disaster drill, you want to bring your neighbors together, first responders together, National Guards together, all of that. The more you practice now, the better it will be in the future. So currently what we're doing right now is on the assumption that a large-scale disaster in Japan might even go beyond the capabilities of their own military, known as the self-defense forces, and U.S. forces would have to interact directly with local communities. We're working with local communities to build up their understanding of U.S. forces in Japan, our humanitarian assistance, disaster relief experiences, our capabilities. And as we share the knowledge and also learn from the local communities about their geography, their response capabilities, their concerns, their estimates, all of those things, we share that knowledge. Hopefully nothing will happen, but we know that Japan is in a particularly volatile area. So hopefully we get this cooperation in place, and that the response time will be even faster the next time something like this happens.
Okay, in the Operation Tomadachi, or just getting it started, you have the disaster strikes, you have this something almost akin to lightning response from the Marines to come and support. What is the role that you personally played in that whole situation?
Well, I don't have a military background myself, and so a lot of the traditional military heavy lifting stuff I'm not an expert on. I have never experienced it. But what I do know is the Marine Corps and also the Japanese government process, the political process, the local communities. I've been up in that area in the past as an academic, and I know a lot of the individuals on the Japanese side, and particularly on the military side. So one of the roles that I served as the political advisor to the forward command element that went up there was to help plug in our Marines and also the soldiers who went up there and joined us into the respective Japanese organizations, and made sure that that connectivity went as smoothly and as quickly as possible. By chance, the head of the Japanese Joint Task Force was an old friend, a lieutenant general who at one point served in Okinawa, and he was also a colleague of my academic advisor at one point. So the personal connections that you develop in your personal lives or work or really play out and help a situation, one that very few people expected. So I wanted to make sure that our two militaries could work together and do their thing, the things that they do very well together. I was sort of the glue to
You were the
help that
Mr.
process.
the Mr. Fix-It, right? If there was a problem, you were right in the middle of it.
If there were a problem and some unique, unconventional approaches to solving the problem were required, I was able to provide that help.
You know, this the reason for talking about this particular situation in the recent Operation Tomadachi is so that you can really appreciate the perspective and the insight that Dr. Eldridge brings to the whole marine relationship with the U.S.-Japan alliance, and we'll get into that further in the show here. You're watching Asia in Review, by the way, a think tank production, and we're talking about the U.S. Marines in Japan, their role in the U.S.-Japan alliance. And our guest here, Dr. Robert Eldridge, is the senior political advisor to the United States Marine Corps in Japan. And well, let's kind of step back just a little bit from this whole Operation Tomadachi, and let me ask you kind of the broad question here. As a consequence to the Marine involvement, working closely with the local people in that disaster situation in the Tohoku region, was there any change or shift in public opinion, attitude towards the Marines in Japan?
Very much so. And the public perception, and more importantly, the public understanding of who the Marines are, what the Marines do, that really spiked and continues to remain very, very high.
Robert, how do you know that?
A number of ways. We travel around the country constantly, and we get to meet with a lot of people. There isn't one engagement where gratitude is not forgotten to be shared
You mean
by the Japanese.
even outside of the Tohoku region, that's true?
Very, very much so. And we have a very strong relationship with Tohoku. We go up there on a regular basis, sometimes several times a month. We're either receiving visitors from Tohoku or we're going up there. One example is we created a homestay program for kids in the affected area and bring them down to Okinawa. So we have a very good relationship. Public opinion surveys have also shown a huge rise in public support, both for the U.S.-Japan alliance, but also for the Marine Corps role in that. And I don't want to make it seem that we're satisfied with that, because that's not why we participated in Operation Tomadachi. One of the issues is that I think the Japanese public has never really had a chance to learn about the Marine Corps. And Japan, as you know, doesn't have its own Marine Corps. It has an army, a ground self-defense force, an air self-defense force like our Air Force, and a maritime self-defense force like our Navy. But they don't have that fourth branch, that fourth service, the Marine Corps. And so for many Japanese people, it's very difficult to understand just exactly who and what the Marines are. In addition, the mission of the Marines is to constantly be ready to deploy to any situation, any climb, any place on a moment's notice. So the Marines are very expeditionary, as you know. We could get up to the Tohoku area immediately because of that expeditionary nature. The Japanese post-war self-defense forces aren't exactly an expeditionary force because of constitutional and legal restrictions. So traditionally, they don't deploy abroad. And so a joint organization that is expeditionary in nature is something that's very, very unique and hard to understand for the Japanese. So we've been trying for many years to explain to Japanese audiences about the Marine Corps. I think when they saw it in action within their own country, the rapid response, we operated from the sea, from the air, and on the ground. And they could see the multiple assets and skills and capabilities that the Marines have, and the passion and the love that they brought to their work.
Wow. What, let me ask you what may be a very difficult question, but let's go back to the timing. The tsunami hits, and I understand there are permissions, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of coordination, a ton of phone calls and some paperwork, but how fast in that situation, how long did it take before there were Marines on the ground in that area? Do you know?
Well, the first main group, the Forward Command Element, arrived on Monday. The disaster was late Friday afternoon. About 15-20 minutes later, once we knew the scale of it and realized that a tsunami was going to be hitting, we stood up a couple of crisis response teams. So the response was going essentially immediately. The next morning, aircraft began leaving Futenma Air Station in Okinawa.
So it hits on Friday, and Saturday morning there are aircraft en route.
En route, loaded with people and supplies.
Incredible.
Right. The permissions and all of that took place at a much higher level. That was done during the course of Friday night, Saturday morning, and you have to realize we're dealing with many different time zones.
Sure.
Our operational commander here in Hawaii, PACOM, as well as the political leadership back in Washington, D.C., as well as in Japan. So we're working with 3 different time zones. As far as a deployment mode, the intention was just to move as quickly as possible, assuming that the requests would be coming for American support. And we have several facilities on the main island, Iwakuni being one example, and that's a shared use facility between the Marine Corps and the Maritime Self-Defense Forces. We also have Yokota Air Base and Atsugi Navy base up there. And so we're able to pre-position supplies and aircraft up there, ready to move into the disaster area as the permissions were coming out. So the pre-positioning really doesn't require any agreements. But fortunately, and unlike the Kobe earthquake, this time around the Japanese government immediately recognized the scale of the disaster and that there was going to be a need for U.S. support in this.
The green light was given.
The green light was given, yeah. And I highly commend the Japanese government for that rapid decision.
Let's take a slightly different tack here on kind of winding up our discussion on this whole Operation Tomadachi. You talked about the tremendous continuing spike in the public opinion in Japan vis-a-vis support for the Marine Corps.
Right.
Let's shift over now and let me ask the same question in terms of the Japanese self-defense forces. What happened with their image with the Japanese people as a consequence of this how they handled or perceived to have handled the whole disaster situation in the Tohoku region?
Similarly, in Japan, among the Japanese public, the support for the self-defense forces has, over time, has gradually risen and is very high. It went that much higher because of their quick and capable response. Japan, like the United States, is a democracy with civilian control, so the ultimate responsibilities are with the civilian leadership.
Okay.
There was, as you're familiar with, some concern on among the Japanese public with the Japanese government's response. However, related to your question, with the public support of the self-defense forces,
military response,
very, very positive, and the morale up there was very high. They had a very capable Joint Task Force commander, General Kimizuka, who's actually, as we speak, is visiting Hawaii right now as part of some meetings that we have with the Army and with the Marine Corps and the Japanese.
This is kind of a continuation of the relationship building push that you initiated in kind of your strategy paper back in 2006, isn't it?
It is, and I'm very glad and proud to see that the militaries are working even more closely together in this realm. But I've since moved on, and I'm looking at local communities, and that I don't want to see after the next disaster, the next lesson learned being, oh, it would have been great if local communities had been able to work more closely with U.S. forces. So, as I predicted, the last disaster and the lessons learned that would emerge from that,
right.
Looking at the next one, and let's try to.
And there will be a next one.
And there will be a next one. So let's try to reduce the damage and the casualties, and let's try to beat the odds by working together ahead of time rather than during or after.
No, I hope, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying this. You're watching Asian Review, and we're talking about the U.S. Marines in Japan, and we're examining their role in the U.S.-Japan alliance. And our guest here this evening, very fortunate to have you, Dr. Robert Eldridge, who is the senior political advisor to the Marine Corps in Japan. In our discussion the last few minutes, Robert, you mentioned the Japanese self-defense forces do not have they don't have this fourth branch of service. They don't have a Marine Corps, and I guess that means they don't have an amphibious capability.
Correct.
And if we were to look at a map of Japan, we see all these islands.
Correct.
And if we look further to the south, we see the controversial Senkaku Islands. And is this a problem? Japan not having a something like the Marine Corps to handle their amphibious needs and other rapid response in other parts of the country? Is this something that's needed?
Well, I think it is, and folks in the Marine Corps view that the same way. But more importantly, the Japanese side realizes that as well, and so they're making efforts to learn more about amphibious doctrine, developing their capabilities, particularly with lift and landing, and they're going out of their way to work closely with the Marine Corps to learn about the best fighting force in the history of mankind. But
he's not prejudiced at all.
So their interest in the Marine Corps has grown exponentially, I'd say, in the past 10 years. And just to give you a few examples or a few reasons for that, there's actually a lot of similarity, a lot of differences, but a lot of similarities between the self-defense forces, and in particular the ground self-defense forces, and the United States Marine Corps. One example is that they're a relatively, small military force.
Okay.
The Marines are relatively small. Numerically, particularly between the ground self-defense forces and the Marine Corps, is almost identical. Their budgets are usually reduced and cut, so they have to do a lot more with a lot less. And then on top of that, their missions have grown exponentially in the past 20 years.
This is the missions of the Japanese Self-Defense Force.
Right, as with the Marine Corps as well. And so they're being called on to do more and more annually with less and less. And
Interesting.
No one does that better than the Marine Corps. And so there's so much that they are trying to learn and are learning. Another example would be the inherent jointness that the Marines bring to the table. I mentioned earlier the Marines can respond from the sea, from the air,
Right.
and on ground. And you know, all Marines understand that they are inherently a joint force and they're going to be working together, and they do that very well. Another thing the Japanese are trying to learn from the Marine Corps is leadership skills, and the Marines are very much not a top-down organization, and they try to instill leadership skills and responsibilities and accountability at a very low level, and so that they empower their junior Marines. That is a concept that's very difficult for the Japanese side to understand, but in a crisis situation, you want somebody being able to make
Kind of think on their feet. Right?
Exactly, informed, responsible decisions. And so, to me, it's less the hardware that the Marines should be most proud of, but the software, the people, the doctrine, the education, the training. And the Japanese have for a long time, in my opinion, focused on the hardware, and now they're trying to learn more and more about the software. So whether it comes to amphibious doctrine, it's not only the hardware, the ships and whatnot that are necessary, but the software. Also, they need to become more joint, work more closely with their maritime self-defense force and the ground self-defense force, and that teamwork, working together, is the best way to overcome any challenge, any disaster. So they have some issues, but importantly they're aware of those issues.
You know what let's do now? We have our audiences sitting on the edge of their seat now, wondering when is this host, David Day, going to start talking about Okinawa?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm concerned about Okinawa, because that's the, in public perception, maybe as a result of some things that have happened in the past, you know, that's kind of the public perception of the problem child of the Marine Corps in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm not saying that that is the case, I'm saying that is the perception. And so that's where this kind of question I put at the beginning of this program, is the omelet broken? And the whole notion that if you, the audience here, they think back in their memory and they recall a rape situation that occurred with a Marine on Okinawa, and they take that situation and then as a result of the refocus on Asia and repositioning, they see a drawdown or a push. The Okinawans trying to push the Marines out of Futenma or Okinawa, and then they see the drawdown, and they add those two things together and get that has damaged the U.S.-Japan alliance, and the omelet is therefore broken. That's a long question, or a long statement. It's not really a question. And so let's get into that a little bit, because I think that's something that we do need to talk about. And so let's. You have the unique ability to you know, walk back and forth across the line, and the line being to work with the military leadership in the U.S. Marine Corps, and then to talk and work with the local political leadership as well as the local people. You are fluent in Japanese. You've been involved in universities there. What happened? Let's start historically. What happened with this unfortunate rape situation? and we'll move forward from there. What
Sure.
happened?
Well, there was a very tragic incident that took place in September 1995, and the rape incident that you refer to. And that was a wake-up call for American leaders, Japanese leaders, the military, and also folks in Okinawa about is the status quo best for the relationship? And so the two governments established a working group to kind of re-examine the situation, hear better and more clearly Okinawan requests, Okinawan demands, make some changes in a whole host of areas, from social issues, training issues, the way facilities are used, looking at maybe closing certain facilities or consolidating certain facilities, maybe moving some training outside of Okinawa. These have been issues that have been on and off in the relationship for decades, but there was difficulty in getting traction, movement on those issues. And part of the reason for that is there are multiple stakeholders and interests, and sometimes vested interests, that tend to slow down the process. A lot of it tends to be a dynamic between the Okinawan communities and the central government, and the U.S. military is sort of thrown into that equation, and there's, in the areas that we can fix unilaterally or bilaterally, in my opinion, the U.S. Makes great efforts in doing that, but there are some areas that really are between the central government and the Okinawan prefectural government.
Which have nothing to do with the Marine Corps.
In many cases don't have anything to do with it. And I'll give you some examples. For those of the viewers who've read about Okinawan history, there's a tendency to have a very complex relationship with the central government, some feelings of victimization between Okinawa and the central government. One of those feelings is that the Japanese government has forced a large military presence, Japanese self-defense forces as well as U.S. military, in Okinawa, that it's unequal compared to mainland Japan, that there's a large burden or impact that the Okinawans incur in that. And those are feelings that are very hard to address or to correct in some cases. They're based over history, over interpretations that maybe certain academics or media report on. One of the reasons that I believe I'm of some value to the Marine Corps there is that most of my research dealt with Okinawa and U.S.-Japan relations. And so I have a very close relationship with academics, media, politicians, NGOs, NPOs, not only throughout Japan, but particularly in Okinawa. Some of my friends are on the left, some are on the conservative side, and so I've been able to gain perspectives over the past 16, 17 years that if you're sitting in one seat, you may not be able to see that perspective. Most of my writings over the past decade plus have been policy-related recommendations. I try to create a dialogue between the Okinawan side, the mainland Japanese government side, and the U.S. government side in my writings in the past. And now in my current position, I try to facilitate a dialogue on a whole host of issues, so that, and the goal now, as the goal was 10, 15 years ago when I was in academia, was to kind of shift the perception of the bases as burdens to ones that are assets, because there's so much benefit that comes from having the bases within Okinawa.
Well, hold on a second now. Give me just 2, 3 bullet points of, because I want to get on another side here. What are the benefits to the Okinawan people of those bases in addition to security? It's kind of like the thing, aside from the aqueducts and the roads, what else did the Romans do for us? But aside from security and the money that's put into the local economy, what are some of the other bullet points in terms of seeing the U.S. Marine presence in Okinawa as an asset?
Well, it's not only the U.S. Marines. It's we're fortunate to have all services represented there, but we strongly believe in human resource development, and so we sponsor a number of programs, whether it's English education to internships in the medical field at the Naval Hospital, or in the international relations field. For example, I created an internship program for Okinawan students to study about precisely the issues that we're talking about right now.
Interesting.
And to also to help further that transparency between the civil society and the military. I mentioned English education, but that is a huge effort for military and their spouses and dependents to go into the local school system as English volunteers. Some of the economic benefits, a number of contractual arrangements between local businesses and the bases, hiring, on-base hiring is very high. The desire of many very qualified Okinawan citizens to work on base is very high, and so we have a great talent pool that kind of go between the bases and the local economy. In our office, for example, 60% of my staff is actually Japanese, and so they are able to provide a perspective that's very unique and very helpful in understanding the situation.
In terms of shaping public opinion on Okinawa, you're talking about it as they leave the base, because they work there, they have a kind of a real inside perspective on the value of the asset to the culture and to the economy.
I think they do, and the education process is two ways. We share and provide information and interact, and we also entertain many opportunities to receive the same. And our office's policy is basically we won't say no to anything. So in other words, say yes to everything, because that increases the mutual understanding and the dialogue and the opportunities that are out there. As far as perceptions that exist in Okinawa, quite often, again, generated by maybe media with some subjective objectives, or academics in some case. Certain figures are used that the U.S. crime rate is very high. That is not true. The U.S. crime rate in Okinawa is much, much lower.
Wait. You're talking about U.S. crime rate by Marines on Okinawa?
And U.S. forces, U.S. SOFA
well,
personnel.
Let's back up a second, because this is a really interesting point here. I've heard it said, and I'm sure that there are a number of viewers out there who have the understanding that the challenge or the push out of the Marines on Okinawa is a consequence of not just this one rape, but legions of young, high testosterone Marines abusing Japanese women and offending the local Okinawans. And so that this one rape incident that we've talked about here is just an example of what goes on day in and day out. And so what you're saying is, no
That's
way,
not
Jose.
true.
No way, Jose.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's not true. There are occasionally very unfortunate incidents like the one that happened 17 years ago. But the incidents are few in numbers. They're much lower than the local statistics, local crime rates. And the perpetrators, if they're found guilty, are severely punished. And the military doesn't tolerate a lack of discipline. And whether it's through the Liberty Campaign Plan, which involves the ability to go out off base, or our education program to help young Marines and other services understand their role as U.S. ambassadors in Okinawa.
Okay.
Through teaching about Okinawan history, teaching about the relationship between Okinawa and the United States, also with between Japan and the United States, Japan and Okinawa, teaching all about these historical, cultural, language, differences, but also the opportunities. And I look at differences as something that's positive, because learning about them and working together makes both groups better. And that's why I used the marriage analysis before, that the U.S.-Japan relationship is like a marriage, and it takes work for a married couple to develop as a married couple. And dialogue is very important, communication, cooperation, all of those things. And the worst thing in a marriage is to be complacent. Similarly, in an alliance relationship, the worst thing is to be complacent. So there's always stuff that we can do to improve. For example, the education program for the young Marines.
So what you're referring to now, education program for young Marines. Let's take a semi-specific example here. You got a group of Marines from Kaneohe Bay that are going to be deployed to Okinawa.
Right.
And so let's go right down to the lowest level. You got some privates in there who are what, 18 years old? What kind of training do they get?
Well, particularly when they come to Japan, they're received at something called the Joint Reception Center, and they go through a variety of programs to orientate them to their new lives in Japan, in Okinawa, what's expected of them there, what are some of the differences, but also the similarities. And however, even if they're similar, they may not be the same. And so, be able to appreciate and learn from the culture. Remember that when we go off base, we are representing not only the Marine Corps and not only themselves as individuals, but the United States as a whole. With the education program, one thing that we've done is reached out to the local universities and invited them to help us develop the curriculum, because I can't think of a better way than to have Okinawan experts that are Okinawan descent creating the curriculum
to train the young Marines.
For training them.
Wow.
So we've gotten positive feedback from some universities, less positive feedback from other universities, because they don't want to have anything to do with the military. And one challenge that we have is overcoming a lot of these misperceptions about the military. And it's not only the U.S. military, but also towards our own military.
Robert, we're going to run out of time here.
Okay.
But give me an example of a misperception.
Another misperception, in addition to the crime rates, is the scale of military bases in Okinawa. Quite often, you will read in the newspaper that 75–74% of U.S. military bases in Japan are in Okinawa. That figure is incorrect.
What is
well, the number is much less. To give an example, one reason that it's incorrect is that there are many types of U.S. facilities. If you look at the aggregate number, it's actually closer to 23%. So it's much, much lower than the 75%. Another reason that 75% is an incorrect number in Okinawa is because several of the facilities are joint use. So they're not U.S. exclusive use facilities. So for example, the 75% isn't true to begin with, but if you were to look at what is the highest number that you can maximize and come up with, probably it's 62 if you play with the numbers, but even 62% is not exactly correct, because many of the facilities are scheduled to be returned based on agreements that are worked out between the central government and Okinawa. So 62% is actually 49, and then if you take the next stage of the agreements,
you're down in the
you're
30s.
down in the high 30s, low 40s.
Okay.
So I don't want to say we're hostage to the relationship between the central government and Okinawa. However, when it comes to facilities, we can't do anything more unilaterally. It has to be a bilateral agreement. So there are actually many, many more examples, but the important thing about developing policy and developing one's understanding about an issue is to examine it from many different perspectives and to be intellectually honest when you're discussing the issue.
You know, Robert, I really appreciate you taking the time to
Thank you.
sit with us and to share with us, to educate us. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've learned a lot. You've been watching Asia in Review, a Think Tech production. I'm your host, David Day, and we've been talking about the U.S. Marine Corps.